Good evening. Tonight, we descend into the most nightmarish chapter of human history. A time when death arrived on every doorstep, when the very air seemed poisoned with despair, and when survival meant navigating a world gone utterly, catastrophically mad. This is the story of how people endured the Black Death, that merciless plague that swept across Europe between 1347 and 1353, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. It's a tale of unimaginable suffering, desperate superstition, medical ignorance so profound it bordered on comedy, and the darkest corners of human nature, but also of remarkable resilience, cunning adaptation, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to oblivion. In the next hour, we'll explore a world where mass graves overflowed like grotesque harvests, where neighbors turned against neighbors in paranoid fury, where physicians dressed like demonic bird creatures, and where the line between divine punishment and earthly horror blurred beyond recognition, before we seal ourselves inside our plague-ridden past. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's see how far this infection spreads across the globe tonight, as we gather in the safety of our modern world to peer back at humanity's darkest hour. The Black Death didn't announce itself with fanfare or ceremony. It crept into Europe like a thief in the night, carried in the belly of a flea, nestled in the fur of a rat, hidden in the cargo holds of trading ships that sailed from the disease-ravaged ports of the Black Sea. The year was 1347, and merchants in the bustling Italian port of Messina watched in growing horror as Genoese trading galleys limped into their harbor. What they witnessed defied comprehension. Ships manned by corpses, their decks slick with blood and vomit. The few surviving sailors covered in grotesque black swellings the size of apples, babbling incoherently as they died before the horrified onlookers' eyes. Within days, the same horrifying symptoms began appearing among the mess. It started innocuously enough: a slight fever, a touch of nausea, perhaps a headache that could be attributed to too much wine or worry over trade disputes. But then came the buboes. These weren't mere boils or pustules, but monstrous growths that erupted from the lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, and neck, swelling to the size of eggs or larger, turning first red, then purple, then an ominous black that seemed to drain the very light from the room. The pain was indescribable. Victims described it as feeling like molten metal being poured directly into their flesh. Many went mad from the agony before death mercifully claimed them, but the buboes were only the beginning. As the disease progressed, victims began coughing up blood in violent spasms that painted the walls of their homes in crimson spatters. Their bodies became covered in dark spots and patches, as if the shadow of death itself was slowly claiming their flesh. The stench was overwhelming, a combination of rotting meat, human waste, and something else. Something indefinably wrong that seemed to emanate from the very core of the disease. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to find words adequate to describe the horror, with one Sienese observer writing that the afflicted died almost immediately. Some in their beds, some in the streets, some in their houses, and they were so many that it was impossible to bury them all. The speed of death was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. Unlike other diseases that might claim victims over weeks or months, the Black Death killed with ruthless efficiency. Most victims died within 3 to 5 days of showing symptoms, though some unlucky souls lingered for weeks in unbearable agony. The lucky ones, if we can call anyone in this nightmare lucky, succumbed within hours, their bodies simply Unable to cope with the bacterial assault unleashed by Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium that would eventually be identified centuries later from Messina, the plague spread with the relentless logic of a well-oiled military campaign. Trade routes that had once brought prosperity and cultural exchange now became highways of death. The disease followed merchants to Genoa and Venice, then spread northward through the Alpine passes into France and Germany. It sailed across the Mediterranean to Barcelona and Marseille, crept overland through the Pyrenees into Spain, and crossed the English Channel to devastate Britain. No corner of Europe would be spared. The social fabric of medieval society, already strained by decades of war, famine, and political upheaval, began to unravel with shocking speed. In Paris, the city's official death toll climbed from perhaps 20 deaths per day in normal times to over 800 at the plague's peak. But these were merely the deaths that could be officially recorded. Thousands more died in hovels and back alleys, their bodies left to rot where they fell because there was simply no one left alive to bury them, or because the survivors were too terrified to approach the corpses. The first instinct of many was to flee, and the roads of Europe became clogged with desperate refugees carrying whatever possessions they could manage. But flight proved futile. The plague seemed to travel faster than any horse or cart. Worse, these fleeing masses often carried the disease with them, inadvertently spreading the contagion to previously untouched communities. Villages that had stood for centuries were depopulated in a matter of weeks, their fields left untended, their churches echoing with silence rather than prayer. For those who couldn't or wouldn't flee, survival became a matter of grim calculation and desperate adaptation. The first lesson learned was that traditional medicine was not merely useless, it was often actively harmful. Medieval physicians, trained in the ancient theories of Galen and steeped in the belief that disease was caused by an imbalance of the four bodily humours, prescribed treatments that would be comical if they weren't so tragic. Bloodletting, already a questionable practice, became a death sentence when applied to plague victims who were already hemorrhaging internally. Physicians recommended purging the body with violent laxatives and emetics, further weakening patients who desperately needed to conserve their strength. The medical profession's response to the Black Death revealed the profound limitations of medieval science. Doctors fled their patients as readily as anyone else, leading to the bitter observation that the physician could heal all save himself. Those brave or foolish enough to continue practicing developed increasingly bizarre theories about the plague's origins and cures. Some blamed it on earthquakes that had released poisonous vapors from the Earth's core. Others pointed to an unfavorable alignment of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn that had supposedly corrupted the air itself. The famous plague doctors, with their distinctive beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, emerged during this period as both protectors and harbingers of doom. The leather beak, stuffed with supposed protective substances like crushed pearls, ground unicorn horn, or fragrant herbs, was meant to filter the poisonous air that was believed to carry the disease. The full costume, a long, waxed coat, gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, created a figure that was simultaneously medieval medicine's attempt at scientific protection and something that seemed to have stepped out of humanity's darkest nightmares. These plague doctors moved through afflicted cities like grim reapers in reverse, their very appearance announcing that death had arrived in the neighborhood. Their treatments were as varied as they were ineffective, lancing the buboes with hot irons, applying poultices made from everything from crushed emeralds to human excrement, and administering concoctions that would challenge the stomach of the most hardened medieval peasant. One popular remedy involved drinking a mixture of powdered unicorn horn and ground pearls in wine, expensive ingredients that proved as useless as they were costly. But perhaps the most telling aspect of medieval medicine's response to the plague was its complete inability to understand the role that hygiene played in disease transmission. Cities that were already cesspools of human waste, rotting food, and animal carcasses made no connection between their filthy conditions and the spread of disease. The irony was bitter, while physicians debated the influence of planetary alignments. The real culprits were the rats and fleas that thrived in the very squalor that defined medieval urban life. The wealthy, of course, had more options for survival, though wealth proved to be no guarantee of safety. Rich merchants could afford to flee to country estates, where they hoped cleaner air and distance from urban crowds might protect them. They could stock their retreats with the finest foods and wines, hire the best physicians, and isolate themselves from the common rabble who were dying in the streets. But the plague was remarkably egalitarian in its appetites. Noble bloodlines that had survived centuries of warfare were extinguished in a matter of weeks. The powerful Duke of Burgundy watched helplessly as the disease claimed his entire family. Kings and peasants alike found themselves equal in the face of bacterial indifference. Some of the wealthy developed elaborate protocols for avoiding contamination. They refused to handle coins that might have passed through infected hands, instead conducting business through intermediaries. They ate only foods prepared by servants who had shown no signs of illness for at least 2 weeks. They burned aromatic woods and herbs constantly, filling their homes with smoke that they believed would purify the air. Some even went so far as to communicate with visitors only through closed doors or from upper-story windows, conducting their affairs while maintaining what they hoped was a safe distance. The poor, lacking such luxuries, developed their own survival strategies born of desperation and bitter experience. They learned to recognize the early signs of plague in their neighbors, and to avoid those areas of the city where the death carts made their daily rounds. They observed that those who lived near sewers and garbage dumps seemed to die more frequently, though they couldn't understand why. Some noticed that families who kept cats seemed to fare slightly better than those who didn't, though they attributed this to superstitious rather than practical reasons. Religious responses to the plague varied wildly and often contradicted each other in ways that would have been amusing if the circumstances weren't so dire. The Catholic Church initially proclaimed that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, urging increased prayer, penance, and charitable giving as the path to salvation. Masses were held continuously in cathedrals and parish churches, though these gatherings often became super-spreader events that accelerated the plague's transmission. The clergy paid a terrible price for their devotion. Estimates suggest that between 40 and 50% of England's clergy died during the plague years, with some monasteries losing every single member. But as the death toll mounted and prayers seemed to go unanswered, more extreme religious movements began to emerge. The flagellants represented perhaps the most bizarre and disturbing response to the plague's horror. These groups of religious fanatics traveled from town to town in processions of several hundred members, engaging in public displays of self-torture that they believed would appease God's wrath and end the pestilence. They stripped to the waist and whipped themselves with leather scourges embedded with metal spikes, continuing until their backs were raw, bleeding masses of torn flesh. The flagellant processions became traveling spectacles of religious hysteria. They would enter a town singing hymns and chanting prayers, then proceed to the main square where they would form a circle and begin their ritual of self-punishment. The crowds that gathered to watch were both horrified and fascinated, many joining in the frenzy of religious ecstasy. The flagellants claimed that their suffering was taking on the sins of the community, that their blood was washing away the spiritual corruption that had brought God's plague upon the world. But the flagellant movement quickly devolved into something darker and more dangerous. As their numbers grew and their influence spread, they began to challenge the authority of local clergy and even secular authorities. They proclaimed that their direct communication with God through suffering made them superior to the established church hierarchy. Some groups became violent, attacking Jews, foreigners, and anyone they deemed responsible for bringing God's wrath upon Christian Europe. The movement eventually became so disruptive that Pope Clement VI was forced to condemn it officially. Though by then the damage to social order had already been done. The search for scapegoats during the Black Death revealed some of humanity's ugliest tendencies. As the plague devastated communities across Europe, people, desperate for someone to blame, turned their fury on the most vulnerable members of society. Jews became the primary targets of this displaced rage, accused of deliberately poisoning wells and spreading the plague as part of a supposed conspiracy to destroy Christian civilization. The accusations were absurd. Jews were dying from the plague at the same rates as their Christian neighbors. But logic had little place in a world gone mad with fear and grief. The persecution of Jews during the plague years was systematic and brutal. In Strasbourg, the entire Jewish community was burned alive in their cemetery on Valentine's Day 1349, with city authorities seizing their property before the ashes had cooled. In Mainz, Jews barricaded themselves in their homes and chose to die by their own hands rather than face the mob's violence. Across the German states, Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were wiped out in orgies of violence that combined religious hatred with simple greed. The debts owed to Jewish moneylenders conveniently disappeared along with the creditors themselves. But Jews weren't the only scapegoats. Foreigners, beggars, lepers, and anyone who seemed different became potential targets for communities looking for someone to blame for their suffering. In some areas, people accused of witchcraft were burned or beaten to death by mobs convinced that supernatural forces were responsible for the plague. Cats were slaughtered en masse because they were associated with witchcraft. An ironic tragedy, since the cats were actually helping to control the rat populations that harbored plague-carrying fleas. The economic disruption caused by the Black Death was as profound as its human toll. With between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population dead, entire industries collapsed overnight. Fields went unharvested, as there were simply no workers left alive to tend them. Craft workshops fell silent as master artisans and their apprentices succumbed to the plague. Trade networks that had connected Europe to Asia and Africa were severed as merchant families died out and commercial partnerships dissolved. But for those who survived, this demographic catastrophe created unexpected opportunities. Laborers who had previously worked for subsistence wages suddenly found themselves in demand, able to command higher pay and better working conditions. Peasants abandoned their feudal obligations and moved to areas where land was plentiful and cheap, often simply occupying farms whose owners had died without heirs. The rigid social hierarchies that had defined medieval Europe for centuries began to crack under the pressure of simple economics. There were no longer enough people to maintain the old order. The survivors also had to develop new social arrangements for dealing with death on an industrial scale. Traditional burial practices, with their elaborate ceremonies and individual graves, became impossible when dozens or hundreds were dying daily in a single community. Mass graves became the norm, with bodies thrown into enormous pits with little ceremony beyond a hastily mumbled prayer. In London, new cemeteries had to be established specifically for plague victims, including the famous No Man's Land at Smithfield, where bodies were stacked in layers separated by thin coverings of dirt. Some communities developed grim bureaucracies of death, with official body collectors making daily rounds with carts, calling for householders to bring out their dead. The cry "Bring out your dead" became a familiar sound in plague-stricken cities, though the historical record suggests this practice was less common than popular culture implies. More often, bodies were simply left in houses until the stench became unbearable, at which point authorities would break down doors and remove the decomposing remains. The psychological toll of living through the Black Death was perhaps as devastating as the physical disease itself. Survivors described a world where normal human relationships had become impossible, where the bonds of family, friendship, and community had dissolved under the pressure of constant terror. Parents abandoned their children at the first sign of fever. Spouses fled from each other's sickbeds. Priests refused last rites to the dying for fear of contagion. The social glue that held medieval society together simply melted away under the heat of existential terror. Many survivors developed what we might now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They became obsessed with death, constantly checking themselves and others for signs of the plague. Some became paranoid recluses, refusing all human contact. Others went in the opposite direction, embracing hedonistic lifestyles with the desperate intensity of people who expected to die at any moment. The literature of the period is filled with accounts of survivors who seemed to have lost their capacity for normal human emotion, describing their experiences in flat, detached tones that suggest profound psychological numbing. Children who survived the plague were particularly damaged by the experience. Many had watched their entire families die, had been abandoned by adults who should have protected them, or had been forced to care for plague victims while still barely old enough to care for themselves. These plague orphans often formed gangs that roamed the countryside. Surviving by theft and begging, their childhood effectively ended by exposure to horrors that would have challenged the strongest adult minds. Yet even in this landscape of horror and despair, human ingenuity and adaptability began to assert itself. Some communities developed surprisingly effective quarantine systems, though they didn't understand the scientific principles behind their success. Venice, already experienced in managing trade-related health risks, established the world's first formal quarantine system in 1377, requiring ships to wait 40 days before entering the harbor. The origin of our word quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, or 40 days. Other cities developed elaborate systems for identifying and isolating plague victims. Houses with confirmed cases were marked with crosses or other symbols, and guards were posted to prevent inhabitants from leaving. While these measures often amounted to death sentences for those trapped inside, they did help slow the spread of the disease in some areas. The city of Milan gained a reputation for particularly ruthless efficiency in this regard, walling up entire houses with their inhabitants still inside, a practice that horrified even hardened medieval sensibilities but may have helped the city suffer less than some of its neighbors. Some individuals developed personal survival strategies that showed remarkable psychological sophistication, even if they were based on medieval rather than modern understanding of disease. Wealthy merchants like Francesco Dettini kept detailed records of plague outbreaks, tracking patterns of transmission and mortality rates that helped them make informed decisions about when to flee and when to stay. Some physicians, despite their limited understanding of the disease's actual causes, became skilled at recognizing early symptoms and advising patients on palliative care that could at least ease their suffering. The most successful survival strategy, though few recognized it at the time, was simply to avoid other people as much as possible. Those who lived in isolated rural areas, or who had the means to retreat to well-supplied country estates and avoid all contact with travelers, had the best chances of survival. Some monasteries that closed their doors to the outside world and maintained strict isolation survived virtually intact, while those that continued to minister to plague victims were devastated. Food preservation and storage became matters of life and death as trade networks collapsed and agricultural production plummeted. Communities that had stockpiled grain and other preserved foods before the plague arrived were more likely to survive the economic disruption that followed the initial demographic catastrophe. Some survivors became skilled at foraging for wild foods, hunting small game, and making use of resources that would have been beneath the notice of pre-plague society. The Black Death's impact on gender relations was complex and often contradictory. Women, traditionally excluded from many occupations, suddenly found themselves performing jobs that had previously been mal-dominated, simply because there weren't enough men left alive. Widows inherited property and businesses that they would never have controlled under normal circumstances. Some convents gained unprecedented independence and wealth as their male overseers died, and secular authorities were too disrupted to maintain their usual control. But women also faced unique dangers during the plague years. Pregnant women seemed particularly vulnerable to the disease. Both the stress of the plague and the medieval understanding of pregnancy as an inherently dangerous condition contributed to higher mortality rates among expectant mothers. Women were also more likely to be accused of witchcraft or poisoning during the hysteria that accompanied the plague's spread, making them targets for the kind of scapegoating violence that claimed thousands of lives. Children developed their own strategies for survival, many of which revealed both their vulnerability and their remarkable adaptability. Plague orphans often formed makeshift families with other children, sharing resources and information about which areas of cities were safest. Some became skilled at identifying the early signs of plague in adults, allowing them to flee before becoming trapped in infected households. The most successful child survivors were often those who attached themselves to adult survivors, who needed help with daily tasks, a pragmatic arrangement that benefited both parties. The survival strategies of different social classes revealed stark disparities in both resources and outcomes. Nobles and wealthy merchants could afford to flee to multiple residences, moving from place to place as the plague followed trade routes and major highways. They could hire servants to handle potentially contaminated goods and could afford to destroy possessions that might carry disease. Poor urban dwellers, in contrast, were often trapped in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions that made transmission almost inevitable. Rural peasants faced their own unique challenges and opportunities. Those who lived in isolated farming communities had better chances of avoiding the disease entirely. But if the plague did arrive, they often lacked access to any medical care whatsoever. On the other hand, rural communities were more likely to have experience with animal diseases and basic veterinary practices that sometimes proved surprisingly applicable to human illness. Some rural healers developed treatments based on herbal knowledge that, while not capable of curing the plague, could at least alleviate some symptoms. The clergy's response to the Black Death revealed both heroic dedication and human frailty. In equal measure, many priests and monks continued to perform their duties even as their colleagues died around them, administering last rites and providing spiritual comfort to the terrified and dying. These brave souls paid a terrible price. Mortality rates among the clergy were significantly higher than among the general population, partly because of their continued contact with plague victims, and partly because communal living in monasteries and religious houses facilitated rapid disease transmission. But the clergy's high mortality rate created its own survival crisis for the institution of the Church. Entire monasteries were wiped out, taking with them centuries of accumulated knowledge and cultural heritage. Libraries full of irreplaceable manuscripts were left to rot as there was no one left alive to maintain them. The Church was forced to ordain men with minimal training to replace the dead, leading to a decline in clerical education and religious scholarship that lasted for generations. Some members of the clergy developed innovative approaches to maintaining religious life. During the plague years, they conducted services from rooftops or through open windows, allowing congregants to participate while maintaining distance. Some priests heard confessions through closed doors or from across courtyards, adapting ancient rituals to the practical requirements of survival. These adaptations would later influence the development of reformed religious practices, though few recognized their significance at the time. The Black Death's impact on art and literature created a distinctive cultural legacy that reflected both the horror of the plague years and humanity's determination to make meaning from suffering. The period saw the emergence of the memento mori tradition in art, visual reminders of mortality that ranged from subtle symbols to graphic depictions of death and decomposition. These works served both as spiritual meditation aids and as psychological processing tools for societies traumatized by mass death. Literature of the plague years captured the period's psychological complexity with remarkable sophistication. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the height of the plague in Florence, used the framework of storytelling as both escape from and engagement with the reality of mass mortality. The work's combination of serious moral reflection and ribald humor reflected the period's strange mixture of despair and defiant celebration of life. Similar works emerged across Europe, suggesting that creative expression served as both individual and collective survival strategy. The economic disruptions caused by the Black Death created new opportunities for innovation and adaptation that would shape European development for centuries. The severe labor shortage drove technological innovation as survivors sought ways to accomplish tasks that had previously been done by hand. Water-powered mills became more common, and there was increased interest in mechanical devices that could multiply human labor. These innovations laid groundwork for the technological advances that would eventually lead to the Renaissance and the early modern period. Trade patterns were permanently altered by the plague's demographic impact. Traditional routes through areas that had been depopulated became unviable, while new commercial opportunities emerged in regions that had been relatively spared. Some merchant families that survived intact found themselves with reduced competition and expanded market opportunities. Venice and other Italian city-states that successfully managed the plague's impact gained commercial advantages that lasted for centuries. The plague's effect on agricultural practices was equally profound. The massive die-off of rural laborers forced changes in farming techniques and crop selection. Some areas shifted from labor-intensive crops like grapes to livestock raising, which required fewer workers. Others experimented with new crops or farming methods that had previously been considered too risky or innovative. These agricultural changes contributed to dietary shifts that affected European nutrition and health for generations. Legal systems had to adapt rapidly to handle the unprecedented legal challenges created by mass mortality. Traditional inheritance laws became unworkable when entire families died out, or when the normal witnesses and record keepers were no longer alive. Some communities developed simplified procedures for transferring property and settling estates, while others saw widespread disputes over abandoned land and possessions. The legal precedents established during the Plague Years influenced property law throughout Europe for centuries. Marriage and family structures were permanently altered by the demographic catastrophe. The traditional arrangement of marriages between families of similar social status became impossible in many areas where entire social strata had been wiped out. Some communities saw intermarriage between previously distinct social classes as survival necessity overrode social convention. Others experienced a baby boom as survivors desperately sought to rebuild their communities, leading to earlier marriages and larger families among those who lived through the Plague Years. The psychological impact of survival created distinctive cultural attitudes that persisted long after the plague had ended. Survivors often displayed a combination of fatalism and hedonism that reflected their direct experience of life's fragility. Some became obsessed with religious devotion, seeing their survival as divine providence that obligated them to lives of exceptional piety. Others embraced worldly pleasures with desperate intensity, determined to experience everything life had to offer before the next catastrophe struck. Education and scholarship were severely disrupted by the death of teachers, students, and entire intellectual communities. Universities lost significant portions of their faculty and student bodies, and many schools simply ceased to function. The transmission of knowledge that had been largely dependent on personal relationships between masters and students was severely compromised. Some fields of learning were set back by decades or centuries as accumulated expertise died with its practitioners. Yet the intellectual disruption also created opportunities for new ideas and approaches. The massive failure of traditional medical knowledge during the Plague Years opened space for alternative healing practices and new approaches to understanding disease. Some surviving scholars began to question ancient authorities like Galen and Aristotle more rigorously, laying groundwork for the scientific revolution that would emerge centuries later. The plague's challenge to religious and philosophical certainties contributed to intellectual developments that would eventually transform European thought. Military and political structures were profoundly affected by the demographic catastrophe. Armies that had been raised through feudal obligation became impossible to maintain when so many nobles and their retainers had died. Some military campaigns were simply abandoned when commanders could no longer field effective forces. Political alliances shifted as entire noble families were extinguished and new power structures emerged among the survivors. But the military disruption also accelerated technological and tactical innovations. The shortage of traditional heavy cavalry led to increased reliance on infantry tactics and new weapons systems. Some military engineers began experimenting with gunpowder weapons and other innovations that would eventually revolutionize warfare. The plague's demographic impact contributed to military changes that would shape European conflict for centuries. Urban planning and architecture began to reflect new understanding of health and disease, though the connections were often misunderstood. Some cities rebuilt with wider streets and better drainage, believing that improved air circulation would prevent future outbreaks. Others constructed new hospitals and quarantine facilities based on hard-won experience with plague management. These physical changes to urban environments had lasting impacts on public health, even when the theoretical understanding behind them was incorrect. The development of more sophisticated record-keeping systems was driven partly by the need to track the massive demographic changes caused by the plague. Surviving administrators developed new methods for maintaining population records, property registers, and tax rolls under rapidly changing conditions. These bureaucratic innovations contributed to the development of more effective state administration that would characterize later medieval and early modern government. Religious institutions were forced to innovate in response to the massive loss of trained clergy and the challenge to traditional theological explanations for the plague. Some orders developed new approaches to religious education that could quickly train replacement priests and monks. Others experimented with different forms of religious community that could survive demographic catastrophes better than traditional monasteries. These religious innovations influenced the development of Reformed Christianity that would emerge in later centuries. The plague's impact on women's roles in society was complex and often contradictory. While some women gained unprecedented independence and economic opportunities, others faced increased vulnerability and exploitation. Widows who inherited property sometimes found themselves targets for marriage by men seeking to acquire their wealth. Single women who had lost their families faced particular challenges in societies where women's safety traditionally depended on male protection. Yet some women used the disruption to their advantage, establishing businesses or taking on roles that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Female artisans, merchants, and even scholars emerged during the plague years, taking advantage of reduced competition and disrupted social norms. Some convents and women's religious communities gained unusual independence as male oversight structures collapsed. Children who survived the plague often displayed remarkable resilience and adaptability, though at terrible psychological cost. Many became prematurely adult, forced to take on responsibilities far beyond their years. Some developed skills and knowledge that served them well in the post-plague world, becoming successful merchants, artisans, or religious leaders, but the trauma of watching their families die and surviving alone marked an entire generation with psychological scars that influenced European culture for decades. The emergence of new folk traditions and cultural practices during the plague years reflected both the horror of the experience and humanity's determination to create meaning from suffering. New religious festivals commemorated plague martyrs and miraculous survivals. Folk songs and stories emerged that captured both the terror and the occasional dark humor of plague life. These cultural innovations became part of European tradition, influencing art, literature, and popular culture for centuries. Medical practice was permanently changed by the plague experience, though not always in ways that modern observers would consider positive. The complete failure of traditional treatments led some practitioners to experiment with new approaches, occasionally stumbling upon genuinely helpful practices. Others became more skilled at recognizing plague symptoms and providing palliative care, even if they couldn't cure the disease. The profession's humbling experience during the plague contributed to eventual development of more empirical approaches to medicine. The plague's impact on international relations was profound and lasting. Trade networks that had connected Europe to Asia and Africa were permanently disrupted, contributing to European exploration efforts to find new routes to Eastern markets. Political alliances were reshuffled as some nations were more severely affected than others. The demographic catastrophe contributed to the eventual decline of some regions and the rise of others, shaping the balance of power that would influence European development for centuries. As the Black Death finally began to recede in the 1350s, the survivors found themselves inheriting a transformed world. The rigid feudal hierarchies that had defined medieval Europe were weakened or destroyed. New economic opportunities emerged as labor scarcity drove wages higher and created demand for innovation. Religious and intellectual authorities that had seemed unquestionable before the plague now faced skeptical populations who had watched their supposed wisdom fail catastrophically. The psychological legacy of the Black Death influenced European culture in ways that extended far beyond the immediate plague years. The experience of mass mortality created a distinctive cultural attitude that combined fatalism with determination, religious devotion with skepticism, and appreciation for life's pleasures with awareness of its fragility. This complex psychological heritage influenced everything from artistic expression to political philosophy, contributing to cultural developments that would eventually lead to the Renaissance and the modern world. Perhaps most importantly, the Black Death demonstrated both human vulnerability and human resilience on an unprecedented scale. The plague years revealed humanity's capacity for both cruelty and compassion, cowardice and heroism, despair and hope. They showed how quickly the most sophisticated civilizations could collapse into chaos, but also how rapidly survivors could adapt, innovate, and rebuild. The Black Death was indeed humanity's darkest hour, but it was also testimony to the stubborn determination that hath allowed our species to survive every catastrophe and continue reaching toward an uncertain but persistent future. In the end, those who survived the Black Death did so through a combination of luck, adaptation, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to surrender to the darkness. They endured horrors that we can barely imagine, witnessed the collapse of everything they had believed about their world, and somehow found the strength to build something new from the ashes. Their story is not just a chronicle of medieval suffering, but a testament to the resilience that lies at the core of human nature, the capacity to face the unthinkable and somehow, impossibly, continue to hope. The mechanics of daily survival during the plague years required a complete reimagining of normal human behavior. Simple acts, like obtaining food, became elaborate rituals designed to minimize contact with potentially infected individuals or contaminated objects. Markets, when they still functioned, became theaters of paranoia, where buyers and sellers maintained careful distances. Transactions were conducted with long poles or tongs, and coins were often left to sit in the sun or pass through flames before being handled. The communal ovens that had been central to medieval urban life fell silent. As bakers died and communities became too fearful to share bread that might carry death in every crumb, water sources became particular points of anxiety and innovation. Wells that had served neighborhoods for generations were suddenly viewed with suspicion, especially after the widespread belief that Jews or other enemies had poisoned them. Some communities posted armed guards at wells, while others developed elaborate systems for drawing water that minimized human contact. Rainwater collection became more sophisticated as people sought sources they could control personally. The wealthy invested in private cisterns and filtration systems that used sand, charcoal, and cloth to purify water, though their understanding of what they were filtering out remained primitive. The transformation of domestic life was equally profound. Households that survived developed new routines built around isolation and decontamination. Family members were assigned specific roles to minimize cross-contamination. One person might be designated to handle all contact with the outside world, while others remained in the inner sanctum of the home. Clothing and possessions brought from outside were often fumigated with smoke, left in direct sunlight, or even buried for specified periods before being handled. These practices, while based on flawed understanding of disease transmission, sometimes accidentally proved effective. Cooking and food preparation became exercises in both preservation and purification. Survivors learned to cook everything thoroughly, not understanding bacterial theory, but observing that well-cooked food seemed safer. Smoking, salting, and pickling techniques were refined to extend the life of stored foods, allowing families to reduce trips to markets where disease might lurk. Some households developed elaborate systems for rotating food stores, using the oldest supplies first while constantly adding to their reserves when opportunities arose safely. The social psychology of plague survival created new forms of community organization that balanced mutual aid with protective isolation. Some neighborhoods developed systems of remote cooperation where families would leave supplies for each other at designated drop points, allowing for community support without direct contact. Others created elaborate signaling systems using flags, bells, or smoke signals to communicate health status, needs, or warnings without face-to-face meetings. Children's games and entertainment during the plague years reflected the grim realities of their world in ways that were both disturbing and psychologically necessary. Traditional games were adapted to incorporate themes of death and survival. Children played Plague Doctor, Spot the Buboes, and elaborate versions of hide-and-seek that mimicked the real-life need to avoid infected areas. These games served both as psychological processing mechanisms and as informal education in survival strategies. Children who played these games often developed better instincts for recognizing danger signs and safe behaviors than adults who relied on formal medical advice. The evolution of burial practices during the plague years revealed both the breakdown of cultural norms and remarkable human adaptability under extreme circumstances. When traditional cemeteries overflowed and proper funeral rites became impossible, communities developed increasingly creative solutions. Some cities established body collection schedules with designated times for each neighborhood to bring out their dead. Others created elaborate systems of mass burial that still attempted to maintain some dignity and spiritual significance for the deceased. In London, the famous plague pits were not simply chaotic dumping grounds, but relatively organized operations that revealed medieval administrative capacity under extreme stress. Bodies were arranged in layers with lime and dirt between them, and rough records were kept of numbers, if not individual identities. Some pits included personal belongings or religious artifacts, suggesting that even in the depths of crisis, survivors sought to honor their dead with whatever dignity circumstances allowed. Rural burial practices adapted differently to plague conditions. Farm families often buried their dead in their own fields, creating private cemeteries that served multiple purposes, honoring the deceased while also marking property boundaries and maintaining connection to ancestral land. Some rural communities developed traveling burial teams that moved between isolated farms, providing funeral services while maintaining careful protocols to prevent spreading infection from household to household. The economic innovations that emerged during the plague years extended far beyond simple labor shortages and wage increases. Entire new professions were created by the crisis: professional body removers, house cleaners who specialized in plague remediation, and traveling merchants who developed expertise in safely transporting goods through infected areas. These new occupations often commanded premium wages, but also carried extreme risks that created their own unique cultures and practices. Barter systems evolved to replace monetary transactions that might involve handling contaminated coins. Communities developed complex networks of goods exchange that could function without physical currency. Some areas experimented with credit systems that allowed for delayed settlement of debts, recognizing that traditional commercial practices were impossible under plague conditions. These economic innovations sometimes proved more efficient than pre-plague systems and influenced later commercial development. That the transformation of religious life during the plague went far beyond the high mortality among clergy and the emergence of extremist movements like the flagellants. Ordinary believers developed new forms of private devotion that could be practiced in isolation, creating elaborate home altars and personal prayer routines that compensated for the inability to attend church services. Some families developed their own religious ceremonies for major life events, adapting traditional rites to circumstances where formal clergy were unavailable or dangerous to contact. The proliferation of private religious practices during the plague years contributed to theological developments that would influence Christianity for centuries. Without formal clerical oversight, lay believers experimented with direct communication with God, mystical experiences, and personal interpretations of Scripture that sometimes challenged orthodox doctrine. These grassroots religious innovations laid groundwork for later reform movements and contributed to the eventual Protestant Reformation. Pilgrimage, one of medieval Christianity's most important practices, was fundamentally transformed by plague conditions. Traditional pilgrimage sites became too dangerous to visit, but the spiritual need for pilgrimage remained strong among survivors seeking divine intervention. Some communities developed local pilgrimage sites, places associated with plague, martyrs, or miraculous survivals that could be visited without long-distance travel. Others created mental pilgrimages, where believers would imagine visiting holy sites while remaining safely at home. The artistic and literary production during the plague years revealed sophisticated psychological processing of trauma that belied medieval stereotypes about emotional primitiveness. Surviving manuscripts include detailed personal accounts of plague experiences that demonstrate remarkable introspective ability and emotional intelligence. Some writers developed new literary forms specifically to capture the plague experience, mixing realistic description with allegorical and spiritual interpretation in ways that created entirely new genres of literature. Musical traditions were similarly transformed by the plague experience. New songs emerged that captured both the horror and the dark humor of plague life, often incorporating sound effects that mimicked plague symptoms or the calls of body collectors. Some musical innovations involved creating songs that could be performed by single individuals or small groups, adapting musical traditions that had previously required larger ensembles to circumstances where gatherings were dangerous. The development of more sophisticated, astronomical and mathematical knowledge during the plague years reflected both the search for explanations and practical needs for improved record-keeping and prediction. Some scholars began developing more accurate calendar systems to track plague cycles, hoping to predict when outbreaks might occur. Others worked on mathematical models for calculating death rates and population changes, creating some of the earliest demographic statistics in European history. Medical knowledge, despite its fundamental flaws in understanding disease causation, did advance in some practical ways during the plague years. Physicians and lay healers became more skilled at pain management and palliative care, developing techniques for making dying more comfortable even when cure was impossible. Some practitioners gained expertise in recognizing different stages of plague development, allowing them to provide more accurate prognoses to families and communities. The emergence of more sophisticated quarantine practices in some areas reflected hard-won practical experience with disease control, even when the theoretical understanding remained flawed. Venice's famous quarantine system was refined through trial and error during successive plague outbreaks, with officials learning to balance economic needs with health protection. Other cities developed their own variations, creating a body of practical knowledge about disease control that would influence public health practices for centuries. The psychological adaptations required for plague survival created lasting changes in European cultural attitudes toward risk, planning, and community responsibility. Survivors often developed obsessive behaviors around cleanliness, food storage, and personal protection that persisted long after the plague had ended. These individual psychological changes accumulated into cultural shifts that influenced everything, from architecture to family structure in post-plague Europe. The impact on childhood development during the plague years created generational effects that influenced European culture for decades. Children who survived the plague often displayed unusual combinations of maturity and trauma that made them different from both their parents and their own children. They developed survival skills and psychological resilience that served them well in later life, but also carried emotional scars that affected their capacity for normal relationships and community participation. Women's roles during the plague were further complicated by the intersection of survival needs and traditional gender expectations. Some women gained unusual independence and economic power as widows or as inheritors of family businesses, but they also faced increased vulnerability to violence and exploitation. The breakdown of normal social protections meant that women had to develop new strategies for personal safety, while taking advantage of new economic opportunities. The plague's impact on marriage and family formation created lasting demographic effects that influenced European population development for generations. The severe mortality among adults of childbearing age created unusual age distributions that affected marriage patterns, birth rates, and family structures for decades after the plague ended. Some regions experienced baby booms as survivors desperately sought to rebuild their communities, while others saw continued population decline as trauma and economic disruption prevented normal family formation. International trade relationships were permanently altered by the differential impact of plague on different regions and the disruption of traditional commercial networks. Some areas that had been peripheral to pre-plague trade networks found themselves in advantageous positions as traditional centers were devastated. New trade routes emerged to replace those that had become unviable, contributing to the eventual European exploration efforts that would reshape global commerce. The development of more sophisticated record-keeping systems during the plague was driven by both practical necessity and the scale of demographic change. Surviving administrators had to develop new methods for tracking property ownership, tax obligations, and legal relationships under rapidly changing conditions. These bureaucratic innovations contributed to the development of more effective state administration and influenced the eventual emergence of modern governmental systems. The transformation of educational systems during the plague went beyond simple disruption of existing schools and universities. Some communities developed new approaches to education that could function with reduced personnel and resources, including more systematic use of written materials and self-directed learning. These educational innovations influenced later developments in literacy and learning that contributed to cultural changes extending well beyond the Plague period. The Black Death's influence on technological development was complex and far-reaching. The severe labor shortage accelerated adoption of existing technologies and spurred innovation in labor-saving devices. Watermills, windmills, and other mechanical systems became more widespread as communities sought ways to accomplish necessary work with fewer people. Some regions invested in new technologies specifically to replace human labor that was no longer available. Military innovations during the Plague years reflected both the disruption of traditional forces and the need for new tactics suited to reduced populations. Some military leaders experimented with smaller, more mobile forces that could operate effectively with limited personnel. Others invested in new weapons technologies that could multiply the effectiveness of individual soldiers. These military adaptations influenced warfare development that extended far beyond the immediate Plague period. Urban planning and architecture began incorporating lessons learned from plague management, though the theoretical understanding often remained flawed. Some cities were built with wider streets and better drainage systems, believing that improved air circulation would prevent future outbreaks. Others constructed new public buildings designed to facilitate quarantine and medical care during health emergencies. These physical changes to urban environments had lasting impacts on city development throughout Europe. The development of more sophisticated legal systems during the Plague reflected both the breakdown of traditional authority and the need for new approaches to social organization. Legal innovations developed during the Plague years influenced property law, inheritance practices, and commercial regulations for centuries. Some communities experimented with more democratic decision-making processes as traditional hierarchies were disrupted, contributing to political developments that would eventually influence modern governmental systems as the Black Death finally began to recede in the 1350s. The survivors found themselves inheriting a world that had been transformed in ways both obvious and subtle. The massive demographic catastrophe had created new economic opportunities and social arrangements, but it had also left psychological and cultural scars that would influence European development for generations. The rigid social hierarchies that had defined medieval Europe were weakened but not destroyed, creating space for new forms of social organization while maintaining many traditional elements. The immediate aftermath of the Plague saw a complex mixture of cultural renewal and continued trauma. Some communities experienced periods of intense creativity and innovation as survivors sought to rebuild their world. Others remained paralyzed by loss and fear, unable to move beyond survival mode even when the immediate crisis had passed. The psychological legacy of the Plague created lasting cultural attitudes that combined appreciation for life's pleasures with awareness of its fragility. Religious devotion with skepticism toward authority, and community solidarity with individual self-protection. The economic recovery from the Black Death was uneven and complex, creating new patterns of prosperity and poverty that differed significantly from pre-Plague arrangements. Some regions that had been devastated by the Plague recovered quickly as survivors took advantage of reduced competition and abundant resources. Others remained depressed for decades as the social and economic infrastructure proved too damaged to rebuild effectively. These differential recovery patterns contributed to shifts in European economic and political power that influenced development for centuries. The religious and intellectual legacy of the Black Death extended far beyond the immediate crisis period. The massive failure of traditional medical and religious authority during the plague years contributed to intellectual developments that would eventually challenge medieval worldviews and contribute to Renaissance humanism. The experience of mass mortality created new theological questions about divine justice, human suffering, and the nature of salvation that influenced Christian thought for generations. The Black Death ended not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the simple passage of time and the gradual realization that the dying had slowed, that children were being born again, that life was slowly, cautiously reasserting itself. The survivors emerged from their nightmare into a world that was forever changed, carrying with them memories of horrors that would influence European culture for centuries to come. They had learned that civilization was far more fragile than they had ever imagined, but also that human nature was far more resilient than they had ever dared to hope. Tonight, as we sit safely in our modern world with our vaccines and antibiotics, our understanding of germ theory and our sophisticated medical infrastructure, we can look back at the Black Death as a historical curiosity, a nightmare from humanity's primitive past. But the survivors of that great dying knew something that we sometimes forget, that the line between civilization and chaos is thinner than we like to believe, that survival often depends on factors beyond our control, and that the capacity for both heroism and horror lies dormant in every human heart, waiting for circumstances to call it forth. Their story reminds us that we are all, always, just 3 days away from barbarism, but also that human ingenuity, compassion, and stubborn hope have carried our species through every conceivable catastrophe. In that sense, the Black Death was not just medieval Europe's greatest tragedy, but also one of humanity's most profound demonstrations of the will to survive, adapt, and ultimately to endure.